Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Transmissions here on FreightWaves TV. My name is Sebastian Blanco. Over there, my co-host Grace Sharkey. Grace, how are you today?
I am doing well. I spent even more time this past week going through that same data set that we talked about on last week's episode. So I have just been digging deep into electric vehicle manufacturing over the last couple days. So it's been a fun ride. How has your week been?
It was much less data intensive. I was on a little bit of a hiking trip out in the mountains, so that was good to get away from everything for a while. But I'm very excited to be back. We've got a great show today. Before we do that, let us hear a word from our sponsors.
When you switch to AIT Worldwide Logistics for automotive shipping, you're partnering with a team of logistics professionals in Asia, Europe, and North America who develop customized supply chain solutions that are just as unique as your business. Whether it's trans-border, hotshot trucking, express ocean service, or an exclusive air charter, AIT has the expertise, technology, and carrier connections to achieve your production goals every time. Check out their link in the show notes.
Okay, we're back. As I said before, hopefully you all know my name is Sebastian. My last name is Blanco. I have a dream someday to interview one of the soccer players for the Portland Timbers, whose name is also Sebastian Blanco. Couldn't get him on the show. That's not really a thing that works with automotive supply chain, but the next best thing, Sebastian Kempf. He is the partner in McKinsey's Düsseldorf office and leader of McKinsey's aftermarket practice. And Sebastian, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Grace, Sebastian. Thanks for having me.
We will now make Grace say our last names each time she wants to address one of us with a question here. But no, the reason we brought you on is back in May, I believe, you released a paper called "Making Every Part Count," and it sort of looked into the future, looked into the aftermarket with COVID and with where things are heading with electrification. Before we dig into some of the details of the paper and the things we want our listeners to know a little bit more about, what can you tell me, just setting up, what was the scope of this paper? What was the reason that you did it? I mean, you're in the aftermarket practice work at McKinsey, so it seems like it falls right in line with your daily work. But why release this paper? What were you trying to sort of what information were you trying to get out to people?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great question for the beginning. You know, when you look at the current trends in the industry, be it electrification, software, connectivity, autonomous vehicles, and so on, right? It's mainly about kind of the new car sales and what's happening now, right? But we are getting more and more questions from our clients and the investors, of course. What will this mean to the automotive aftermarket in the next years to come, right? And the automotive aftermarket is basically always driven by the underlying car park, and that takes some more time to change, right? So always lagging a couple of years behind. So it takes a bit longer for the trends to hit in, but they will certainly hit in. And the question is then, when does it happen? For what components does it matter? How are the different players affected? And we wanted to get a grasp around that, right? This is also why we call it making every part count, because it will depend very much on which component we are talking about and how this whole situation will play out. Yeah?
And, it was really interesting reading the article because in my head, I guess it never really clicked to me that when we are dealing with these autonomous vehicles, there are certain customizable components that will not be able to be on these cars. So could you dive into some of these specific components that are going to see different demand trends in the aftermarket?
Absolutely, Grace. So one good example, or the most prominent, is probably the electrification electric vehicles. So as a matter of fact, they will have significant smaller number of moving parts, right? So we expect the basically aftermarket revenues for a battery electric vehicle around 30 to 40% lower when it comes to like parts. Think about oil filters and parts like that. However, on the other hand, we also expect that we will see an increase in services, right? Think about battery services, charging services, right? We will see like a lot of cloud-based battery services. You just mentioned autonomous vehicles, right? How do they work with a lot of software and with a lot of sensors, and these sensors need checking and calibration, right? So this is why we expect the aftermarket overall to experience a growth and relatively stable, which it had been in the past, but the composition will change significantly. Yeah?
And I know one of the things that is mentioned so you just mentioned that there's maybe 40% fewer parts in an electric vehicle versus an ICE or internal combustion engine vehicle, and therefore, obviously, if you have fewer parts to replace. And yet, the paper says that the lower amount of money that people spend on parts could be made up in the sense of revenue from subscription services or, like you said, charging services. Do you think that overall the amount of money people are going to be paying for their cars will be roughly the same, just spread out over time? Will it be lower? Will it be higher? Like, how does this change in the amount of parts that are going to be used in the cars in the first place, and then also need to be serviced after purchase, affect people's overall cost for driving a vehicle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in general, the industry is also in kind of a business model or go-to-market transformation, going away from like a really strong focus on one-time sales to recurring revenues and lifecycle monetization, right? What are revenue streams and services over the lifecycle? A lot of OEMs made this now a very explicit part of their strategy, and I also see the industry going there. And there are a couple of drivers behind. First of all, of course, the aftermarket services, which is parts and services. You also have auto finance, leasing, insurance. You then have digital services, connected services, and so on. So I think this whole variety of recurring revenues and services over the life cycle will gain a much greater importance going forward. No, absolutely.
Do you have any estimates on how that will affect overall cost? I understand the change in where people spend money, but obviously every car and every owner will be different, but just in general, do you detect any trends going in one direction or the other?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Of course, to answer that, you would need to look at the whole mobility value pools, right? And where people spend their money on, I would call like the general mobility, right? One part is maybe owning the car. You now have a lot of leasing and subscription services. So we also see a trend from like owning to other forms of ownership, right? Then you have like shared mobility, and the question is, how will people allocate kind of their budget, right? So my expectation would be in absolute terms, it might stay roughly the same or increase even a bit, but it will differ kind of where this budget goes to, into which type of mobility services. And when you look in the vehicle ownership, we will see, of course, a stronger increase when it comes to life cycle services. Because I think in the future, it will not be so much anymore that people like purchase all the accessories and so on when they purchase the car, to bring that example, but that they may want to activate certain assets, certain software features in their car while using, or they might not want to do it, right? Or just for the winter when you talk about seat heating or things like that, right? So we will see a greater variation there also of the revenue pools, and the different services.
It's interesting. I actually did an article a couple weeks ago on this same type of trend, but more focused on the actual like heavy duty trucks. And it's really this like SaaS model that's gone from Silicon Valley into all of these different areas. And it was interesting to see. I think it was Volvo is working with IBM on these type of like aftermarket type of cloud services where their trucks on the way into being serviced can let the servicer know, hey, this is what's wrong with it. This is what needs to get fixed, which is great for a truck driver, right? Because they can get on the road a lot faster. So to focus more on the passenger type vehicles, are there companies out there that you feel like are starting to invest in the type of really employees to help service these more cloud-based type of aftermarket services? Or is there anyone that sticks out in your mind that's really pushing for this already?
Chris, we clearly see this trend, and we also see the emergence there of new ecosystems, right? So there will be not like a lot of players that can do everything that you mentioned on their own, right? So we see OEMs, for example, working together with suppliers, working together with leading software firms, working together with startups, and you name it, to create these services. But it's exactly as you described. Like when I follow your example on aftermarket services, I think there's still a great potential of like predictive maintenance, of leveraging the data, the analytics that you can do today, right? For various use cases. Yeah, it starts with diagnostics, right? It comes to personalized offerings, so that you, Grace, get a personalized offering versus Sebastian, right? Based on your driving behavior and so on. So I think that will be the future. And for players to be successful in that, I think corporations and partnerships will be key, and we see that already today.
Do you see any changes being made in the way that automakers are building cars today to take advantage of this? Obviously, they're putting in communication modules for all kinds of reasons, whether it's just updated map information or traffic information or something like that. But in figuring and thinking about moving forward with more of a subscription-based model, I mean, they're not going to install a credit card reader in the car or anything, but are they putting in different parts, maybe making something more easily swappable, like a better antenna from 5G to 6G or whatever comes next, things like that, to take advantage of these services down the road? Or is it still going to be the car is the car that you buy, and if you don't have the right sensors, you don't have the right communication module, you just have to get a different car or not get that feature?
Yeah, that's indeed a very relevant development we see. So, for example, here in Europe, in some markets, we still have a relatively high share of BTO, build-to-order cars, right? That are customized, that you do in the configuration system, and it's exactly the car that you want when it comes to exterior technology, interior, and so on. So when you now look at the trend that people go more for like a short-term leasing or subscription, right? So other form of ownership with shorter duration, that will automatically lead to the fact that cars need to be pre-configured much more, right? And for that, you need to clearly think, okay, what is basically the equipment, the technology that this pool of customers that I'm selling those cars to or renting those cars to prefer, right? So we probably see some changes in the pattern, how the cars are equipped, right? And I would also see then a shift from build to order going much more also into build to stock, or then build to specifically for those leasing and subscription services, right? The other point I would like to mention, Sebastian, is indeed how do you equip the car that you basically can do those connectivity or this remote update services over time, right? That is one big factor, right? With flashing and all the technologies that are possible. That's a very relevant trend we also see today. And the other one I would like to mention, when you look at the aftermarket, now like sustainability and green parts are also getting much more attention in the aftermarket, which is, I think, definitely also an important field to look into. And there, for example, remanufacturing parts can play an important role, right? So that parts are not thrown away, but remanufactured and used again, right? Clearly more sustainable. And these things also need to be thought of in the development process already, right? Remanufacturing ability of parts, right? And you need to think of that before when you develop the car or when you develop the parts. So there are a couple of things to consider. Okay, what do I need to actually plan for about the things that happen over the course of the life cycle? Yeah? Because at one time it might be too late, right? So that also gives more complexity for the development processes, clearly. Yeah.
You in the article you gave areas that companies can focus on to prepare for this, I guess, shift in trends, right, to this more service model. Could you dive into those and really what you feel like is going to be the biggest hurdle for these auto manufacturers in this shift?
Yeah, very happy to, Grace. So I think there are a couple of dimensions, right? First of all, you need to clearly specify, okay, what is like the service portfolio I want to offer in the future? What are the after-sales services I want to offer? What are like the finance, leasing, insurance services I want to offer? Autonomous services, right? Battery charging services, and so forth, right? So if you think about that, you have quite a complex service portfolio in the future. The first question, I think, is which one of those you want to offer or you want to own, right? And which you might want to leave out because you cannot do all at the same time. I think that's a question of like this more strategic portfolio. This kind of, okay, which services are really important? What are important customer interfaces? And where do I want to play an important role, right? And based on that strategic portfolio decision, you then, of course, need to work on the technology, how to make it happen, the go-to-market model, how do I bring it to the customers, what's actually my monetization model. I just mentioned partnerships, ecosystem, right? How do I deliver that, right? Do I maybe need to build up an ecosystem and all the steps that then follow, right? And that will clearly depend on the type of players. You mentioned automotive OEMs, but of course suppliers need to think about kind of the same questions for their parts portfolio, right? Or aftermarket players like workshop chains, distributors, how do they go ahead with digital services in the aftermarket, right? So different fields there for the players, but I think it will be relevant for all of them, right?
You hinted at this in your question or your answer about the way that cars are ordered in Europe, where there's a lot of sort of bespoke production happening, not really bespoke, but very specific. You pick all your features. Can you talk a little bit about this, the differences in region that you see affecting the aftermarket? I know the report looks out to 2030 with the US, China, and Europe being sort of the three main players here. Is everybody moving at kind of the same pace? I believe you say that China is kind of in the forefront here, and there can be a lot of reasons for that. But talk about the regional differences that you see affecting these sort of aftermarket revenue streams and aftermarket changes happening in the next decade.
Yeah, very good questions. 2 or 3 quick comments. Let me start with Europe and the US. We see kind of the same growth rates there, 2 to 3% CAGR per year. Why is that? Because the market there is already quite saturated, right? So the car park is staying relatively stable. It's growing a little bit, and the cars are getting on average a bit older. It's around 10 to 11 years today, and we expect to increase that by another 1 or 2 years average age, right? So that leads to the fact that kind of the aftermarket revenues will grow 2 to 3%. The composition will be a little bit different. For example, in the US, we see already a higher share of e-commerce online sales of part parts, and I think Europe is now following. We also see more what I just mentioned, remanufacturing of parts, right? I think the US in terms of market share, which is I think already about 10 to 15% for reman parts, is already quite ahead. So the structure between Europe and US, they differ a bit. The overall CAGR and development is the same. You mentioned China. China, we clearly see above market growth, like if you compare it to the other regions. And I mean, the first basic reason is that this is just the continuation of the new car vehicle boom that we saw over the last years. And that's now, of course, coming into the aftermarket. This is why the aftermarket is growing. On the other hand, you also see a lot of regional differences there. Chinese customers want different service concepts, higher convenience. They are also much more like using the mobile WeChat and how they want to communicate with like the service providers, right? So there we also see significant differences.
Yeah, every time I've been to China in the last few years, watching the growth of WeChat and people wanting the way that the automakers talk about what their customers want in those really connected cars, whether they're from NIO or XPeng or whoever, they're offering things that we're not really thinking about here. So that makes total sense that there's a bigger change happening there.
Absolutely. Because they are basically also they have the chance to leapfrog maybe one or two steps, right? Because they did not have the workshop chains and the structure that the US and Europe maybe had for decades. So they are leapfrogging a bit. And you just mentioned a couple of OEMs. They do, for example, like a one-click aftermarket solution where it's like on a mobile phone, right? You get a personalized offering price, right? The data is submitted. So things like that are currently emerging in China, and these are things probably we in the US or in Europe can actually learn from, right? So these are exactly kind of the regional differences we see there. Yeah.
We're starting to run out of time here towards the end of the episode, but I noticed one statistic in the report that I wanted to get your comment on. We love to talk about electrification here. It's one of the things that I know most about, so I'd like to try to weasel that into every conversation. And I noticed that in the report you predict that EVs will make up, I think it's 18 to 26% of the global car park, and I think that's in 2030. You mentioned there's a couple percent growth, that can happen each year. How did you arrive at this number? And is it sort of almost mathematically inevitable that we're going to get to that, or do you see that that's your rough guess, but it could be 15, it could be 30?
That's of course $1 million question, right? And we have our McKinsey scenarios based on how is like customer demand changing, how is the supply side developing, like the electric vehicle offerings, how is also regulation, CO2 standards, emissions, and so changing, or regulations in different countries, regions, right? So there's a complex model behind. What's actually the most complex part is projecting like the electric vehicle sales over the next years, right? For the different countries. And based on that, we then translate it into the aftermarket car park, which is then quite easy because when you know some car is sold, you have to make an assumption about the average age, or is the car going somewhere else, and so forth. But that's a relatively easy step. So we start from the electric vehicle sales, where we have our projections, and then we transfer it into the car park assumption based on that sales development and then the average age, usage, and so on, right? And what you clearly see here, of course, we see much higher percentages in the next years to come when it comes to the new vehicle sales. For the car park, you see, of course, given an average age of 10 to 11 years, that this will take some time until the electric vehicle share gets a significant share of the overall market. What does it now mean for the aftermarket? That means the opportunity as well as the challenge that you need to live for quite some time with those technologies in parallel. You will have for a lot of years the ICE vehicles in the car park, right, that are sold today, they will be around for the next 10 years. And at the same time, the electric vehicles are ramping up. And workshops, for example, need to get prepared. You need new capabilities, right? High voltage, how to software, I already mentioned, how do you do battery repair and logistics, right? And I think the challenge for the aftermarket will be that for the next like 10 or 20 years, you need to live with those technologies in parallel and define your necessary setup, technology, capability, people to fulfill that. That will be the interesting question there on how to deal with that. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's the big shift that is happening in the auto industry, and we love just being a little part of it and tracking it here on Transmission. So, Sebastian Kempf, thank you so much for joining us here today. Again, Sebastian is a partner in McKinsey's Düsseldorf office, a leader of McKinsey's aftermarket practice, and as you heard, he knows what he's talking about. So, Sebastian, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to speaking to you again sometime in the future.